Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Sam.
And I'm Melissa.
I grew up in the FLDS community. It is a polygamous group run by Warren Jeffs, which I moved out of when I was 18 years old.
I was raised LDS, and Sam and I have been married for almost 8 years now and have 2 beautiful babies together.
Yes, we do. And today we have a very special guest. We're very excited to have with us today to share his polygamous heritage, John Dehlin from the Mormon Stories podcast.
Yes, thanks for being here, John.
Hi, y'all. It's so great to be back. Sam and Melissa, it's an honor to be on your show now.
We had the privilege of getting to be on Mormon Stories just within the last month. And when we were talking more to John, finding out that he had polygamous heritage as well, and being raised LDS or Mormon, that is, you'd be surprised how many people have polygamous heritage. Like, I remember feeling out of place growing up because both of my parents were converts. And like on Pioneer Day, I always, like as a little kid, felt so sad because I didn't have any pioneer heritage or polygamous heritage or any of that. So I feel like a lot of times it's more common than what we think, but it's so special to be able to have somebody know a lot about it and be able to share that. So
there's this weird Mormon thing where it's unspoken, but you have more credibility if your ancestors go all the way back to the beginning of the church, and if there's polygamy somewhere in there, you kind of have a little bit more cred, which is twisted and bizarre, but it's actually kind of true.
For the first while there, I mean, polygamy was very, very common and popular. So it's not surprising that a lot of members of the church have that heritage of polygamy in there somewhere.
Yeah, and I feel like it was, like you said, like very much having this righteous heritage, or even when you think of like Nephi, like having been born of goodly parents who are of the Lord, like you have that sense of like, if you have that heritage and your family, it's like something to be very, very proud of.
It's a flex.
You know?
It's a flex.
Yeah, it definitely can be, depending on who you're talking to. But for those of our viewers who have never heard of Mormon Stories, John, will you give a quick overview of what you do on Mormon Stories and kind of what the mission and purpose of that is?
Sure. Yeah. So I started to really question my faith back in around 2001 while I was working at Microsoft. I had been born into the church, raised in the church, went to seminary, served a full-time mission in Guatemala, went to Brigham Young University, met my wife Margie at BYU. We got married in the temple, and had 4 children. And I was kind of in a tech career when I was studying to be a good seminary teacher for the church, lost my faith, and realized that it was not only really hard to lose your faith within Mormonism, but that there was no support, and that the internet was going to make it even more difficult and more common for people to lose their faith. So I struggled with depression for probably 2 or 3 or 4 years at Microsoft after I lost my faith. And finally, I just decided I needed to dedicate my life to supporting others who went through a faith crisis. So I left Microsoft in 2004. I started Mormon Stories podcast in 2005. Initially, I started it as a actively attending member, and the goal was just to support people in faith crisis and help the church become more hospitable to people who start to question their faith. And I did Mormon Stories for about 10 solid years, moving from just audio into video slowly. And then in 2015, the Mormon Church excommunicated me for the podcast and for my advocacy for women and LGBTQ people within the church. And that was the same year that I finished my PhD in clinical and counseling psychology. And so since 2015, I've been sort of doing Mormon Stories podcast full time, where you can find us on YouTube under Mormon Stories. You can find us on Spotify in just audio only format. And we have TikTok and Instagram. And all we do is just support, we have a threefold kind of mission. We want to, provide the world with accurate information about Mormonism. So we talk about all the difficult things that Mormons are uncomfortable talking about, like polygamy, like history, like racism, sexism, and homophobia, that kind of thing. But then we also want to support Mormons who are in faith crisis. And then finally, for all those who decide to leave the church, we want to help them build a happy, healthy life after the religion. So that's a little bit about Mormon Stories. You can find us at mormonstories.org.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. That was great. And yeah, I know that you have helped a ton of people. And for those who haven't seen our interview, on our channel, we're mostly talking about what it's like growing up in polygamy and interviewing people about polygamy. And we get all the time people asking a little bit more about our stories, having left the LDS Church just recently within the last few years. So we will leave a link below to our Mormon Stories, where John interviews us if you want to know more about our Mormon story.
Yeah. And really, I mean, thank you for that explanation. I think that having so many people on your podcast and on your YouTube channel and to be able to share their stories has helped so many other people that have had questions and concerns about the church and have maybe decided to move away, to have that support and be able to listen to other people's stories and realize they're not alone. So I do believe you've helped a lot of people in that journey.
Yeah, absolutely.
And check this out. The 3 videos that I did with you guys combined have something like 216,000 views in only like 1 month.
Wow.
Wow.
The channel we did is up to 148,000. And then the 2 individual ones are 61,000 and 47,000. So
wow,
people have really valued our collaboration. So
yeah, we've really enjoyed it, which is why we were so excited to have you on and to have this collaboration and hopefully give people a chance. I mean, everyone normally sees you as the person interviewing, and that's what everyone's comfortable with. So I'm super excited to turn the table a little bit and hopefully have people get to know a little bit more about John Dehlin and more about his family and where he ties into those roots as well.
We don't claim to be as good at interviewing, but this will be fun regardless.
Might be better. You guys might be better, actually. We'll see.
Yeah. I guess last thing I'll say before we kind of hop in and let you start telling your polygamous heritage story is there anything specific that you would want to say to viewers before getting into this topic, talking about your family? Are there any disclaimers or anything that you want to kind of mention, or what your motivation for wanting to share this is?
Yeah, totally. So I've probably been interviewed maybe 10 or 15 times over the past 18 years where people wanted to kind of hear my story. So when you guys asked me to come on, or when we started talking about coming on, I thought, what can we do that's a little bit different? And as I was kind of thinking about that, and I know your channel's focused on polygamy, obviously, I thought, wow, several years ago, I prepared a presentation after I'd been excommunicated, where I was trying to kind of tell my story. And I thought, wow, why don't I start with my polygamous ancestry? Because I don't really know anything about my polygamous ancestry, believe it or not. So I started preparing that presentation, and I started to go down this rabbit hole where I started studying my polygamous heritage, and because it was like a 1 hour presentation, and just the polygamy portion of that presentation of my history kind of grew to be an hour in length just in and of itself.
Wow.
And so I shelved that entire part of the presentation, never released it. And then, 4, 5, 6 years have gone by. And so I thought, wow, that I started researching my polygamous ancestry years ago, never did anything with it. It would be kind of fun to go find those slides, dust them off, finish my research, and learn for the very first time my own polygamous ancestry, because I knew I think this is going to be common for many members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You hear about the polygamous ancestry, but nobody really knows any details. And so it's just kind of that thing that sits in the background, and you basically know 2 things. You know that somewhere in your ancestry it was practiced, and you know that it was all positive. You know that everyone was happy, all the wives loved each other, and they're nameless and faceless, and you're just told that everything is peachy keen and happy. And so what I did is I spent maybe 3 full days researching my polygamous ancestry, and I put a PowerPoint presentation together on what I learned. And this has never been shared. It's not only never been shared on the internet, I haven't even shared this with like my own mom, it's her mom who was in a polygamous family. And so this is just brand new, and it's exciting, and I'm honored to be able to share it on your show.
Well, we're very honored to be the first ones to share this with the world.
Yes.
Wow. That's exciting. I didn't know that you hadn't shared this story at all before.
No, I've never shared it. And I'll just say one more thing. I don't pretend that anybody's really going to care about my polygamous ancestry. And by the way, this is almost like a documentary. It's going to take an hour or two, and it kind of goes into detail. But I really benefited from this entire research project, and the seed I want to plant is I want to encourage all your LDS or Mormon listeners and anyone who ends up watching this to consider doing what I did and going back and doing the research, because it you think 2 or 3 generations back how boring. It was gripping for me, and I think it will be gripping and valuable for all of you to go back and do the same thing I did. I just think it's a good exercise to learn about your ancestors, and it's just fascinating. Almost like a true crime documentary, just
Right.
you start drilling and you peel the onion back, and you just, it's fascinating where it all leads. So
And
I hope
there's so many. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I hope we'll start a trend. Us 3 will start a trend of people doing their polygamous genealogy, basically.
Yeah, doing some research. I mean, I bet everyone will be surprised how many ties there are and how many people were involved in the polygamist, I guess, way of life back in those days.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because Sam, as we talked about on your episode, like growing up LDS, the FLDS people, they're weirdos, right? They're the weird people. They're twisted and bad and dirty but that's my grandma. You know what I mean? So what am I, 2 generations away from polygamy? And yet somehow I grew up thinking I was so superior to all the rest of those other people. And the truth is we're all the same. We really are.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, there's so much to be learned from the past to begin with, right? I mean, even just normal family history that doesn't involve polygamy can be so gripping and so exciting to learn more about. But I think also, one, it helps ground people, and we try to do that a lot on this channel, is remind people that you can look at it and be like, that's so crazy, that's so weird. But even if you don't have family that had polygamous heritage, you can find more similarities in your own family or the way that you were raised. There's always so many more similarities to just human beings than what people would realize, right? And so it's always cool to be able to look back and see those similarities.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Well, we're excited to get into it, John. We'll want us to pull your slideshow up here.
Absolutely. So I think I'm up to 59 slides. And so,
all right. Good. A lot of good stuff.
I hope we don't take too long, but I'm geeking out. So I hope people will enjoy it.
We love it. We're geeking out with you.
Okay, so here's my presentation. I entitled it My Polygamous Mormon Ancestry. And I'll begin what we're going to do is we're going to do a time machine format. So I'm going to go backwards in time. I'm not going to start at the oldest date and then move forward. I'm going to kind of move back in time slowly, because that's kind of how my digging works. So I've got a Back to the Future reference there with that famous DeLorean, Michael J. Fox, etc. So let's go back. Come with me in the time machine, my polygamous time machine.
Perfect.
All right.
This is a photo of me while I was a BYU student. I was a sophomore right off my mission. I was a resident assistant at Chipman Hall in Helaman Halls, and it was homecoming. I think this was in the fall. And I learned that a bunch of women in my ward were not invited to homecoming. And so, of course, what did I do? I rented a big, huge, 18-passenger van, and I took all the girls who had not been invited to homecoming on a date. And so I see this as the first evidence that polygamy was in my blood. How does that sound?
That's so sweet of you, though.
Or weird. I don't know. But
no, for all of those girls, and I can say this because I was the girl who oftentimes didn't get asked to dances. And I can tell you, for all those girls, it was very sweet.
Oh, we had fun. It was totally innocent. There was nothing weird that went on, and I wasn't romantically involved with any of them, but we just had fun. And so I just thought that'd be a funny way to start.
Yeah.
Going back a tiny bit further, this is me and my family. This is when we lived in Katy, Texas. This is probably in the late 1970s. That's me in the bottom left with my leisure suit, my polyester leisure suit, and the
Love
John
it.
Travolta
Stylish.
disco collar. That's my dad and mom and my two sisters and my brother. I was the youngest of four. And my mom, she's the one there that's got Nan above her head. And she's the one with the polygamous ancestry that we're going to be covering today.
Okay.
How does that photo look to you guys? Does it look?
That looks.
Oh, you guys
That
are
looks
styling.
great. You
Like
guys-
I'm like,
You
the
had
hair's
some
on
style
point.
back in those
It's like
days.
that Olivia
man.
Newton. My sister Julie's got that Olivia Newton-John hairspray
Uh-huh.
curl.
They got the hair down.
They got
They
the hair
really,
down.
really do.
So
Yeah.
I have to ask really fast here: was your dad ever, or was he a convert to the church, or does he also have some?
So interestingly, my dad was born and raised in Salt Lake City, and I have no information about any polygamous ancestry on my dad's side. I'm at least a fourth generation Mormon from my dad's side. In other words, I think my dad's grandpa joined the church possibly in either Sweden or England, but I know nothing about any polygamy through my dad's side.
Okay.
But he's not a convert. He was born in Salt Lake City, but he was born to a kind of a low income person. And that's an interesting thing is my guess is my dad's ancestors were too poor and not powerful or influential or connected enough to have been invited to live the principle.
Okay, I can see that. That I saw that same type of thing happen within the FLDS community, so I can relate. I saw that type of thing.
Yeah. So my mom came through power and influence, and my dad didn't. Basically,
Makes sense.
yeah. Thanks for that question. That's it. And I want you. I think you guys are going to be able to help me understand my family better than I have been able to in terms of my polygamous ancestry, just because you guys have studied polygamy much more than me. So I'm looking forward to your feedback as you ask questions and maybe give me insight into what's going on. Is that okay?
We'll try to solve this mystery together.
Yeah, help me solve my polygamous mystery. Okay, so now I'm going back a little more in the time machine. That's my mom and dad, like on their wedding day.
Oh,
They got married in the St. George Temple, and
same
that's
as us.
me.
Wow.
And that's me. Yeah, it's St. George, right? That's
St. George Temple, yeah.
Exactly. That's where we were
that's
married.
where you guys were married, right?
Yeah,
That's
it
correct.
was.
Yeah. So they were. I obviously wasn't there. I wasn't born yet, but that is a picture of me as a baby.
Wow.
And my parents were. They eloped into the
Oh,
St.
really?
George Temple, which
Well,
has its own fun story. So
yeah, especially if they had like Aaliyah's family, like if their parents were, you hear that sometimes where if no family could go into the temple, then maybe they would kind of elope to the temple themselves. But to do that when you actually have member family is
Interesting,
definitely unique.
So why St. George?
I don't totally know. I need to. I've asked them several times. I just know that my mom was engaged to a wealthier, more affluent Mormon of status, but then she went off to California to help my aunt who was having a baby and who was really sick. My dad was in the military, and they met. And my dad, who was poor but charismatic, he was kind of like the bad boy, the Mormon bad boy. He kind of swept my mom off her feet, convinced her to cancel her engagement.
Wow.
And he drove back to Franklin, Idaho to just tell my mom's parents, I'm marrying your daughter. And so it was I don't want to say it was a shotgun wedding. I don't think she was pregnant or anything. I just think that it was like done in haste. And I wonder if my dad just felt like if he didn't hurry and marry her, she might, go back to her former fiance. I don't know.
Wow.
So
well,
he
good
had
for your
some-
dad going
Yeah.
after.
He
That's
had
awesome.
moves.
He went and grabbed what he wanted. You know what I mean?
awesome.
He went after it. My mom's glad she did it because she loves her kids. So
Fantastic.
yeah. Okay. So going back a little bit more, that's them when they were dating. And that's kind of fit in the 50s. So we're getting into the 1950s now when my mom and my dad were dating. But this is where the polygamy starts. So this is my grandmother, Karma Benson Parkinson, as she eventually became known. Her maiden name was Karma Parkinson. So this is my mom's mom. Okay.
Okay.
And I knew Karma. She was born in 1896 in Logan, Utah. And she was the daughter of William Brigham Parkinson and Edith Benson.
Wow.
And this is a picture of my grandma and grandpa, when we knew them. So that's me in the bottom right. That's my family a little earlier than that family picture you guys saw while we're sitting on the fireplace. And that's my grandma and grandpa. Now they lived in Logan for most of their life, Logan, Utah. But my grandma Karma was kind of born and raised in Franklin, Idaho, which is kind of like 30 minutes north of Logan in Cache Valley still, but in the southern Idaho portion of Cache Valley.
Okay.
And so, so that's my grandma and grandpa. He died before I really ever knew him, but I knew my grandma, and I actually was able to ask her what she remembered about polygamy, because she lived into my high school years. And by then I was curious about the church and the history. And so I asked her what she remembered about polygamy, because her mom was the plural wife of a, that's how close polygamy is my grandmother lived the principle as the daughter of a third wife, basically.
Oh.
Okay.
And
that's what I was going to ask. Third wife. Okay.
yeah, we're going to get there. But all I remember her telling me is everyone was happy. That's it.
We hear that all the time.
Yeah, you asked Karma. Yeah, I asked her, like, how was it? And she said it was wonderful. We were all happy. We all got along. Everything was great. And I loved it. And I've got really happy memories. And I got pretty much nothing else out of her.
Interesting.
About that. So that's, for me, that's interesting, because once I started doing the digging and the research, I found that it wasn't all happy. Right.
There's always an underlying story. That's for sure.
Do you know your grandma Karma? Did she leave the house at 18? Was she there? Like, how old was she when she married your grandpa? Do you know?
She was a little bit unique because she did it. We're going to talk about that actually, but she actually she was one of the first female graduates of what is now Utah State University, what was the agricultural college. But she defied her father and got a 4-year degree. And because she was so determined to get a degree, she didn't get married early. She got married, I think, in her early 20s.
Okay. The only reason I ask is because it seems like a lot of times, like in the FLDS or other polygamous groups, a lot of times if they leave at a younger age, like leave home, then all they remember is the happy things, right? And they are not old enough to either be forced into a plural marriage themselves and realize the darker side of it, or be old enough to really have adults bother to tell them or be open with them about the negative things as well. So I was just curious if she, going to school, even being able to be out of the house at a younger age, I wonder if that influenced her. Everyone was happy.
Well, I do think like my mom never knew her grandparents. So we'll talk about that in a second, but this is the way polygamy works, right? If you're a later child of a later wife, your grandparents, you may have never known your grandparents.
Correct. Yes. I knew one of my grandparents, and that was it.
Yeah.
And it was my father's mother. She was the only one that I ever met, and she even died when I was a young boy. So yes, because I was born to the second wife, but I was not her. What's that? About middle. Yeah, it was about middle of her children. So there were so many in fact, all of the first wife's children were born long before I was born. So yes, it's a very common thing to not know your grandparents at that in the polygamous family.
So my grandma Karma knew her dad, obviously, but she was a later child of a third wife, and he was quite old when she had a relationship with him. And then he died in 1920. Interestingly, during the influenza, the big flu pandemic that swept the world. He was a doctor. We'll talk about that in a second. But she would have been 22, 23, something like that when he died. So he died pretty young. And so my mom never knew her grandparents.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. But she did know, some of her other sister wives, sister moms. I forget exactly. I don't know what she would have called them, honestly. What do you call again your other
The other mothers?
So they were just other mothers, really.
Okay, other mothers, yeah.
To us children, we would call them by we would say mother and then their first name.
Okay.
So it would be like Mother Karma, for example.
So Karma never talked to me about any other mother than her own mother. So
interesting.
I don't, and in her history, we'll get to this in a second. She never references any of her other mothers in her history.
I wonder if in the time that her parents were practicing polygamy, it was more on the, keep it secret a little bit. I wonder if it was during those times.
We're totally gonna get to that.
Okay.
Sorry, not trying to jump ahead.
Oh, it's good. It's so fun. You want to jump.
Yeah.
You want to jump into it. Okay, so this is Karma with her husband Bernice Parkinson. So my grandmother Karma was a Parkinson, and she married a Parkinson. So there, marrying your cousin, right? Probably.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So her maiden name was Karma Parkinson, right?
Okay.
Now, I don't know how close cousins they were. I don't think they were first cousins or anything, but they were definitely both from Preston, Franklin area. And for those who aren't Mormon, Franklin, Idaho is right next to Preston, Idaho, which is where Napoleon Dynamite was filmed. So all this area that we're talking about in Idaho, just think Napoleon Dynamite, but like 100 years before. Is that fair to say?
I love it.
It's true.
Yeah.
So this is Karma with her husband, Bernice. They had 6 children, and that's my mom in the bottom left, Nan. So my mom was the 5th of 6 of Karma's children. And so those are all my aunts and uncles on my mom's side.
Interesting.
And that's Karma when she was younger, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then this is now Karma as a young girl with her family. So Karma's mom, it was named Edith, and her dad was named William. And they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They had 8 children that lived. And so that's Karma there on the left. And so those are my great grandparents. Those are my mom's grandparents that my mom never knew. And that's Karma, my grandma, that I did know. And it's William who was the polygamist. So
and Edith was the third wife.
And Edith was the third wife. So William is my great grandfather who was a polygamist.
Interesting. Do you know if they lived in separate homes, the other wives and their children?
That changes in the story.
Okay.
So there were times when they lived in the same home, and there were times where they lived in separate homes, and that's where it gets really interesting. So can we save that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. I'm just looking at this picture here, and in my youth, I remember growing up, and when we went to get pictures of the family, there was typically a picture taken of all of us together with all of the mothers and all of the children, at least those that were still living in the home. And then there were these separate pictures taken, like you see here with your family, where it was one of the mothers, all of her children, and then the father. So I'm just curious how close the other family was together.
Oh, totally. When this photo was taken, Edith lived in her own home.
Okay.
But there were times earlier when the wives lived together, and we'll talk about that in just a second.
Alrighty.
Yeah, and that depends so much too on like the different polygamous sect that they were. I mean, if they were mainstream Mormon versus even when we've had people from the Kingston group on the channel before. I mean, they always keep it separate. And so it's interesting also to see where they changed it. There could have also been those breakoffs where people were choosing to do that more. And there's a lot of those different moments in history where they treat it a lot different. So.
And to be clear, William's polygamy began before the manifesto. We'll get to that, but at least 3 of his wives he married before 1890. So this is all mainstream Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints polygamy, no fundamentalist offshoots because it's pre-fundamentalism.
Pre-fundamentalism. Okay, good to know.
Yeah. Okay, so what I thought would be fun. Well, not fun. So my grandmother Karma wrote a history, and since we're talking about Karma just a little bit more, here is Karma's autobiography. It's called Bernice and Karma, And there were just a couple quotes that I thought were kind of interesting from Karma's history that I thought I wanted to share. So I'm going to read this, okay? And this is a quote that Sam, I really want to hear your perspective on, but you as well, Melissa.
Sure.
So Karma writes, this is the section where she starts talking about her father, okay? So she's talking about William, and she says, father, and this is interesting because I never called my dad father, right?
Mm-hmm.
I called my dad, right? And my mom never called her dad father, but my grandma called her dad father. And so this is weird language to me to hear someone in my ancestry say father. That's actually a weird way to address a dad in my upbringing, but it's totally normal for you, right?
Yeah.
It was the only way to refer to him. We were not allowed to say dad. It wasn't even an option.
Yeah, I called my dad dude. Like if when my dad calls me, I pick up the phone and I'm like, "What's up, dude?" And he's like, "Hey, dude." So like this is very formal, but it's how my grandma addressed her dad, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so she says father was a self-made man. He came from England with his parents when he was a small boy. He crossed the plains to Oregon and he grew older. When he grew older, he found his way to Utah working at different jobs. As I remember him, his hair was beautiful, wavy and white. He didn't talk a great deal. When he came home from the office, he started reading his newspaper or some book. He was always studying. Now, this is where it gets interesting. It writes, he enjoyed delving into subjects such as psychology, palmistry, astrology, and learned to read the stars and read horoscopes. So the first thing I'm asking myself is, what in the heck is like a pioneer Orthodox Mormon doing getting into palmistry, astrology, and horoscopes? Like I was taught as a kid that stuff was like the dark arts, that stuff was kind of evil. So, and by the way, Karma was a name that he got as he traveled to the East and learned about mysticism and Eastern religions. And that's where he got the name Karma for my grandma. But this is where it gets a little bit disturbing. So he writes, I didn't like this idea so much. This is my grandma Karma talking. I didn't like this idea so much because some man he studied with wrote Vida's horoscope. So Vida was my grandma Karma's older sister. So some dude that my great-grandpa William knew studied one of his daughter's horoscopes. Her name was Vida. He studies Vida's horoscope and predicted that something awful would happen to her Vida. So Vida wasn't allowed to grow up normally and have boyfriends.
Whoa.
She never went out, only when escorted by one of her brothers, and she was very unhappy and didn't marry until she was too old to have children, which was a tragedy. Now, of all accounts, Vida was the most attractive of all of William and Edith's children. She had beautiful red hair. Her hair stayed red until she was old, but because of some weird astrological, and I probably think some sort of weird sexual control, my great-grandma never let Vida have a normal dating life, and she didn't marry till he was dead, and she was beyond child-rearing age.
Wow.
Wow.
It's kind of dark, right?
Well, and it's so interesting because, like you mentioned, in the LDS and Mormon culture, like going astrological signs or believing in astrology and that kind of stuff is like major no-no. Like that's weird juju that you just don't mess with. So to have him be interested in that stuff to even begin with, let alone letting it somehow control any kind of dynamic in their family.
Yeah.
I mean,
interesting.
When, I don't know, personal revelation or family revelation is one thing, but to have somebody else from the outside in astrology make up something that's kind of unheard of, I feel like, especially back then.
Right.
But I you hear, so I have no reason to believe there was any, sexual abuse in my ancestry. But if there is in fundamentalist polygamy, and if there is in mainstream Mormon families, why wouldn't there be some in my polygamous Mormon ancestry? And I think we often, I have a psychology PhD. Like I think about psychology, like why wouldn't there have been abuse in my ancestral heritage? And I just wonder, I do wonder whether my great-grandfather thought Vita was attractive, felt weird feelings towards her, and for some reason used this astrology as some sort of justification for locking down and controlling her sexuality. I have no idea whether there's any truth to that. This is all speculation, but I do wonder, because to me, that's creepy and weird.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. And not even like I don't want to say the normal creepy and weird, not even the atypical creepy or weird that you would typically see in Mormon ancestry or polygamy. So,
right. Yeah. I mean, obviously growing up in the FLDS, dating is not allowed. Everything is, all the marriages are arranged, and everything is only done by assignment, that type of thing. So this sounds very common to me as far as not allowed to date and all that type of, I don't know, way of life. But the fact that it was only the one daughter, that's where it gets a little bit interesting. And I don't know, it seems that the more you research, the more you find that there was a lot of so-called personal revelation given to, family members or church members that was just for who knows what reason.
Yeah, because I'm sure Edith wanted Vita to have a happy life, but I'm sure my grandfather William had all the power, and whatever he said goes. You know what I mean?
Well, and it's weird, the fact too, it said that something bad was going to happen to her.
Right.
And so they were protecting her. So you're like, well, what kind of bad thing
did happen to her? She was kept from being able to date and have kids.
Well, right? and some people might not even understand. So for those of you viewers who aren't familiar with Mormonism in general, having a family is the most important thing. And as a woman, you are told from a very young age that having a family and having children is the most important thing in your whole entire purpose for being on this earth.
Yep.
So I feel like anytime anybody or any organization specifically keeps women from fulfilling that, while at the same time telling them that's the most important thing, like what's happened in the FLDS, that's cruel. Because her entire life, I guarantee, she was told about how important it is, and that her entire importance as a woman relies on her being a wife and a mother. And so to withhold that one thing is just so sad.
And so she had to watch all her sisters and brothers get married and have kids. And she, interestingly, she lived in the home with Edith and Karma when Karma was younger. And Karma writes about remembering Vita always playing the piano and how beautiful of a piano player Vita was. And Vita helped raise all the other kids, kind of as almost a sister wife, but just as kind of an extra help to the family.
Yeah.
Interesting. Wow.
That's so sad.
Yeah. And that's just Vita. So that's just one slide. So this is another thing from Karma's history that I thought was interesting. And this goes back to what Sam, you said about like families and status and control, because William was clearly obsessed about who his children married and whether or not they married into the right families. So she writes, father was also very strict about people who courted his children coming from, quote, good stock or the right families. I was always embarrassed when a new boy came to take me out, and I would introduce him to my father. He would look at him and say, who is your father? Even before saying hello.
Oh, wow.
I believe that this is a very important factor in courtship, but I don't think parents should interfere too much. They should teach their children correct principles and let them choose their own life mates. Father was very determined that several of my half-sisters, so she makes a veiled reference to polygamy there, shouldn't marry certain boys, but as things turned out, it seemed that they would have been better off and much happier if they had married the boys they fell in love with first, but gave up because of some objection that father had to them. And so, Sam, here's the thing. We didn't have a Warren Jeffs telling the daughters who they could marry, but William kind of played that role with the siblings of my great grandma, or with the siblings of my grandma.
Yes, and I wonder. In fact, I kind of know, because I've heard of other examples and stories, that a lot of the the fathers of the home, and I say father because that's what we were required to refer to them as, did have that type of control. Now, for example, this was before Warren Jeffs, because he kind of came in and did things even crazier and more and different than the leaders before him. But the fathers would generally present their daughters to the leaders of the church or the prophet of the church and say, my daughter is at a certain age and now she's, so the fathers did have a lot of control of when their daughters would get married and who they would get married to.
Well, and I also wonder how much of it is also still a little bit of the time period, because you hear of that being very common in that time period. Even someone who isn't Mormon, if you go back and look at that time, a ton of people nowadays, the idea that a father could keep you from being married until you're past the age of being able to have children, that's unheard of. A girl would just leave their parents. So the amount of control that the family had overall, I'm guessing, when this would be the early 1900s, right?
Late 1800s, yeah.
Late 1800s,
early,
yeah. So, in that time period too,
it's true.
On top of the religious part of it, definitely, I'm guessing played a big role in that as well.
And even in 2022, there's still arranged marriages in India, very, very common. And on the one hand, it'd be easy to put all this on Mormonism, when in reality, like you say, a lot of this is just the time period in the United States. On the other hand, the reason why I feel a little bit of righteous indignation and anger towards my ancestry is because all of this was done under the auspices of God leading the one true church and a patriarchy that was ordained by God, where the men had exclusive priesthood authority. And so when there's the undue influence of a layer of religion, of sort of exclusively true religion layering on top of it, then I hold it to a higher standard than I would just normal people living on the frontier. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, because you have the time period, and then when you add the Mormonism, it amps it up. When really, and a lot of times, some of my criticism with things that have happened historically within the LDS mainstream church too, is if this is the one true church, shouldn't we be ahead of the times on the way we treat women, not behind?
Exactly,
shouldn't we be ahead on racism? And so if things are coming directly from God, you would hope that those type of situations, we would be slightly better than the norm for that time period, not slightly worse or making the normal cultural norms worse at every single aspect. And I think that's continued on even to this day.
Well, and that's where it becomes difficult for the mainstream LDS church, is because they kind of change after the fact, right? After the times. But this is one of the things that the FLDS church uses as proof that they're the true church, because they just don't change. They haven't changed, and they say God doesn't change, and this is the way he wants things, and this will be the way it is forever. So anyway, that's just an interesting thought, that the FLDS church they haven't changed, and they use that as a I guess way of proving that it's the truth.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah. And so like you said, Melissa, like you said, Sam, I've had respect for, believe it or not, for Mormon fundamentalists, because they seem to have more integrity than modern LDS church members do in terms of staying true to the original form of Mormonism, if you can say there was an original form of Mormonism. But to your point, Melissa, if this is God's one true church, we should be ahead of the times, not behind. And so that's why I'm a little bit frustrated about some of this cultural stuff. So
absolutely.
And that takes us to the next one, which is kind of really disturbing to me. This talks about karma's determination to get an education. And I referenced this earlier, but this actually followed to 2 more generations. But I'll just read what Karma wrote about her desire to have an education. She writes, "I was always glad that mother was determined that I go to school as long as I wanted to, because she had been deprived of a formal education. Every fall after I started college, father would say, quote, 'This will be the last year. A high school education is enough for a girl,' close quote. But I would always plead that I would be qualified to teach high school if I could just finish, and mother would come to my rescue and I'd register again. And when I finally got my degree and contemplated teaching, I was so shy and scared. I felt like I just couldn't teach. And father was sweet and said, "It will be all right. You don't need to." And then she says, maybe it would have been better for me if he had pushed me out on my own, and I would have overcome my inferiority complex many years sooner than I did. But I was happy to get married and have a family, and had a feeling that I could teach school and support my children if I had to. Also, I felt that my education better qualified me to be a mother. So a couple reflections here for me, and then I want to hear your reactions. Number one, mad respect for Karma for fighting for education. Number two, mad respect for Karma's mom, Edith, for kind of supporting Karma's desire. Not so much mad props for William for being just so lame, although he ended up letting her. But again, if this is the one true church, why weren't they fighting for women to get educations instead of teaching her that she didn't need an education, right? But then also, Karma was the exception, because my Karma and Bernice taught my mom the exact same thing. So my mom was taught a woman doesn't need more than 2 years of a college education. And so my mom never finished her degree. And my mom taught my sisters that college wasn't that important for a girl. And so, neither of my sisters grew up believing that college was really important. And so that legacy continued down to my actual siblings. Now, my one sister did end up getting an online master's degree, but my other sister never graduated from college. And so for all those reasons, it's kind of a sad and interesting legacy about women don't need an education. They're kind of just good for getting married and having babies, right?
Well, there were two things that she said in that quote that really stuck out to me. Let me go back to that, if you don't mind me reading it. But when she said I felt my education better qualified me to be a mother.
Yeah.
And that I had a feeling I could teach and support my children if I had to. I still think those are two things that women in the church, even still now, maybe a little bit less, we're getting a little bit further and a little bit better on that. But I'd say even when I was in high school and going to school as like a young girl, the reasons for an education were never to be able to get a career. I was even told, like, your reasons for getting an education should be to be able to teach your children and to be able to have a backup plan if something was to ever happen to your husband. Yeah. And so when I read that, I was like, well, some things haven't changed in 100 years, because that I still feel like the church still places, those are your main two reasons for getting an education as a woman. It's not to get a career. It's for those same two things that she was told clear back 100 years ago.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And it really does women a disservice to this day. It's a sad legacy of a more fundamentalist time.
Yeah. And even when, that's awesome that she fought for it. And when she was saying that she had insecurities about it, when you have to fight and fight and fight as women, but then everybody's going to be scared to actually execute and use that education. And if you feel like you had to fight so hard and no one really cared that you had it to begin with, I can't imagine how hard it would be to feel valuable in, okay, well, now I could actually use it and go forward with something, and not have that support, because again, you only need it for those two reasons. And
right.
So that's too bad.
It's interesting to see how much comparison there is between things that you're reading and this kind of your ancestry that were the way I grew up. Right. So it's so interesting to see how when the times didn't change throughout the church with the FLDS and they tried to keep everything the way it was. Yeah, everything that you're saying is just, that sounds normal to me. That's just how I grew up, right? So very interesting, but even more so, I will say my father growing up, he thought it was really important that people got an education, not so much for the girls, but for the boys, and he would always encourage us to get an education. He even wanted us boys to take the GED and get some type of diploma. Anyway, but it was, I feel like the church kind of overpowered his desires and kind of took that his importance of education and kind of set it aside, and no, all the boys just need to go out and work and start making money. And so anyway, but even though he was very interested in education, it seemed like, I don't know that he ever went to any of my sisters and offered and said, hey, maybe you should get a GED. It was always to the boys. So it's interesting how time just, I don't know. I grew up just the same way that your ancestors did.
We joke all the time that Sam was raised in the 1800s.
Yep.
Like, that's just, that's how it was. And it's kind of the same thing that his grandmother was talking about, the fact that the women in the FLDS, they could go to school if it was specifically for a purpose to serve the church, right? So if they were to go and become nurses or school teachers, or things that are very inherently like feminine, type positions that the church would need, then they could go and receive an education. But it still came back to those two things,
Right.
Yeah. It's a part of our legacy that I think I'm not super proud of, and for God's one true church, I would have expected them to be progressive on women's rights, not behind the times.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the last thing I pulled from Karma's history that I thought was just really interesting. So she would have published this in, I don't know, the 70s, I'm guessing 1970s. She published this kind of late in her life. So this would have been long after the manifesto, long after being concerned about the implications of people knowing that her parents were polygamists. But what I'm showing here is a page where she's talking about her dad, and she's super proud of the fact that down in the bottom left, there's a photo of her dad in a horse and carriage in front of he had a pharmacy, the first pharmacy in downtown Logan. And he was one of the first people in town to have a horse-drawn carriage. So she includes the photo of her dad in the horse-drawn carriage. And in the top right, she includes a photo of her dad with, I think, the first horseless carriage or automobile that was in Logan. So they're mentioning her dad. She's mentioning his career. She's mentioning his profession. She's mentioning that he was a doctor. She mentions all the different places where he trained at Rush College, Medical College in Chicago, at University of Louisville. She'll mention all these things about her dad. Guess what you will not find in her entire history?
Polygamy.
Yeah. So what would you expect if Karma was going to write a history about her life and she was going to have a whole section on her dad? What's a paragraph at least you would imagine she would include in her history?
Yeah. So either she was keeping it secret. Let me ask you, before you answer, give an explanation. Describe to me a paragraph you would expect to see in her description of her dad, knowing that her mom was a third wife. Tell me what, if she was just telling her history, tell me what type of paragraph you might imagine. I would like to hear that. Yeah, I would assume that she would mention that. I guess it depends on the way the family dynamic was. In my family, it was very much. I was very close to so many of my siblings that were half siblings. We grew up together in the same family. I had extra mothers in the family because we grew up as one big family, and I would think that there would be a lot of information to share about how that experience was for her. Definitely.
Yeah, exactly. And go ahead, Melissa.
Oh, I just thought too, I would almost expect even more than a paragraph in the part about her father, I would expect that to be part of her own identity. Mm-hmm. So I would expect the very beginning of the book to be, I was this number child of the third wife, mm-hmm. and and go on. And normally, and even when we have people on our channel and stuff, that's always almost one of the very first things. Where'd you grow up? How many mothers did you have? And what number child were you in that? What did that dynamic look like? And that's always still a piece of their identity, whether they're happy about having grown up in polygamy or not.
Yeah.
That's still a huge major part. So I feel like that's almost the beginning to everyone's story normally when they're sharing who they are. Or even if you're not grown up in polygamy, if people ask, oh, tell me a little bit about yourself. Oh, I'm the oldest of 4 children. You know,
Exactly.
that's a very typical first thing. And so I'd say even before you'd get to the other members of your family or talking about your father, that would be a part of your initial identity. If it was something that was normalized and you're proud of, which kind of leads to what I think Sam was going to say. And if you're not proud of it, or if there's something to hide about it,
exactly,
or you're not happy about it, that would be the only time I can see omitting that.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I was going to say. Is either she was trying to keep it secret, which it sounds like at this time, polygamy was more secretive, right? She wrote this book after the manifesto, or was this before?
She would have written this book in the 70s or 80s.
So it wouldn't have mattered anymore.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like,
but I mean, it doesn't seem like she was proud of it. Either that, or the other wives were kept so far apart and the families kept so secret that, but you would still expect something along the lines of, my father would visit our family on such and such days or every other week.
And let me just tell you what it does include. So it starts out with her. The very first paragraph is like, my first home. That's the first section. She goes on for several pages. Then it's around the outside of our home. And so it's not until like the 5th page where she starts the section on my father. And exactly what I was expecting to see here is, my father was born in this, he was born in England, which it has. He came to the United States, which it has. His dad died, his mom died. He came to Utah. His early career, all that's there. What there is nothing of is my dad's first wife was Elizabeth, and they got married so-and-so and started having kids. And then my dad's second wife, was Clarissa, and they got married here and they lived together there. And then several years later, my dad married his third wife, which is my mom, which is Edith. And then later, my dad married his fourth wife, which was Margaret, and they were married here, blah, blah, blah. None of that was in the history. And that's what I wanted to see, because this is her dad, right? This isn't some other dude. This isn't even a grandpa. This is her dad. But it makes, now I do want to say, Sam, to your point, she does reference that she had at least one other kind of mom, and she does mention some half siblings kind of in passing. So it's not like, and there is one mention of polygamy in the whole thing that I'm about to show you. So it's not like she's trying to completely act like it never existed, but it's almost absent from her entire history. And that explains why my mom knows almost nothing about this.
Yeah.
If I asked my mom, who are your other moms? Who are your other grandmas? She's like, I don't remember, I don't know much about them. And it's because they were completely left out of the history. And so I don't mean to belabor the point, but that's weird to me. It's weird to me that Karma didn't mention her other moms at all by name. It's like they're invisible to history.
Very interesting. I mean, we've talked to some other polygamous groups that do things a little bit differently than the FLDS. And it seems like they, in some cases, didn't really like or get along with the other wife and children of that mother, because there was kind of this competition of which family's the favorite. And so there may have been some animosity there that created some type of reason for her not wanting to even mention them in the history. Who knows? But you never know. If it was something along those lines, I can see why maybe she would keep them out.
I feel like it almost would have to be something that big in order to not have it be a big contributing factor to who you are. In Sam's case, he was raised by all the mothers. They all influenced who he is. And one of my older sisters that's actually from my father's first wife, as a baby, she basically raised me. So, I mean, it was just one big family. Everyone was included and everyone was involved. So very unique and different from what I hear from some of these other groups.
Yeah. Well, I do have a few theories about why they were left out. Number one is during the time that my great grandfather was marrying women, it was right before the manifesto. And then we'll find out that one of the wives he likely married her after the manifesto. And with several of the wives, if he married them, he would have to move away and escape the law and actually move to different cities and even states to avoid being incarcerated. So there's certainly a lot of the polygamy happened during the time it was outlawed and they were on the run. So that's part of it. And then part of it, I think we'll find out that at least 2 of the marriages didn't end up so well. I think that might be part of it. And then I think part of it is you fast forward to modern times and the Mormon church is embarrassed about polygamy and wants to pretend that that's something that never happened or happened so much in the past it's not really relevant. Those are some of the explanations I have, along with the fact that Karma was a later wife, younger child, and she barely, she didn't really know her. She probably didn't know her other mothers very well, because some of them died when she was probably relatively young.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't mean to belabor that point, but my point is, if we go back to the slides, she'll mention her dad's car. She'll mention her dad's horse and buggy. She'll go into extensive detail about his profession, but won't mention the women he was married to. And it's also, I guess the point I'm taking way too long to emphasize is it's just another example of how women are commodities and kind of like props or commodities instead of humans, who matter, whose lives and stories matter. They're almost just commodities.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I mean, keeping them out of the story, it proves your point. So it's very interesting.
Okay, so here's the only paragraph I have in the entire history about polygamy. And right off the bat, I thought it was super fascinating that she misspells polygamy. And part of why that's interesting is because she's not a dummy. She's super smart. And like I said, she had a college degree, right? So I don't know what's behind her misspelling polygamy. But here's the paragraph talking about her mom, Edith. Karma writes, she had lived polygamy, Polygomy. She had lived polygamy and believed it was God-inspired and taught me to feel the same way. Now, let me just give you an explanation of what you're about to read. I'm about to read to you is Edith's explanation for why she loved polygamy. And I want you not only to pay attention to her justification for why she loved it, I want you to pay attention to what she's not saying about why she loved it. Okay. So I'm going to now read. So just so you know a little bit about Edith, Edith, as the third wife, was the daughter of a Mormon apostle. So Edith was a Benson, and she was the daughter of Ezra T. Benson, who is like the grandfather of Ezra Taft Benson, who eventually becomes a prophet for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Right.
Ezra Taft Benson's like grandfather or great-grandfather was one of the earliest apostles to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints back in like the Nauvoo, Missouri time period. So Edith was the daughter of an apostle, but which is why William, was probably why William was interested in her. But Ezra T. Benson had died, and so Edith grew up poor, even though her dad had been an apostle.
Interesting.
Okay? So this is Edith writing about why she was glad she practiced polygamy. And I think this is one of the most shocking parts of this whole presentation. Karma says, Edith said, I can remember her, Edith, telling me of a dream she had at the time. It was hard for her to live this law. Okay, so right there, something is interesting. Karma's admitting that polygamy was hard for Edith to live, which is the only reference I'm aware of where Karma ever admits, or Edith ever admits, that it wasn't all happy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here is why Edith was happy, even though it was hard. Karma writes, Edith dreamed that she had a dream once. So she dreamed that she went to a meeting that was held at the tabernacle. This would be the Logan Tabernacle. And her father, one of the apostles, was sitting on the stand. Now, honestly, I don't know if she meant the Logan Tabernacle or the Salt Lake City Tabernacle. So I take that back. I don't know which one it was. But Logan had a tabernacle at the time. Anyway, she has a dream where she was attending a meeting at the tabernacle, and her father, one of the apostles, was sitting on the stand. There was a vacant seat next to Ezra T. Benson, her dad, and he motioned to her to come up and sit there by him. She always felt that she would be rewarded by being with her father in the next life, because she was the only one of his 36 children who lived this divine law. Now, I want to hear your reaction to that.
Well, that is one very loaded small paragraph.
Wow. There's a lot
What
in
are
there.
your reactions? Both of you. I want to
Oh
hear.
my gosh.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll go first.
Yeah.
Well, I think a couple things are super interesting. One, the fact that out of 36 children, she was the only one to live the law at that point in time. That's pretty, I mean, I know that they were kind of phasing out of polygamy at this point, but still, that is interesting. I think the thing that stood out to me the most, though, is that she was excited to live with her father instead of with her spouse. Because as a woman in the church, you're told that once you are sealed to your spouse, and especially those fundamentalists who believe in polygamy, like you're getting sealed to the spouse so that you become, you know, the goddess, so that you can be their spouse in the eternities and create your own world and have your own spirit children in this new world. And so the idea that she's living the law not to live in eternity with her husband, but to live in eternity with her father is very, very interesting. And I don't know where doctrinally she would have like wound up at that conclusion, other than, I mean, the dream. But
right. I mean, it seems, I mean, obviously she respected her father and put him on a very high pedestal, and to say things like that and to want to be with him through all the eternities, right? So it's interesting. I'm not sure about that. In what I was taught, the way I lived, I don't know. I mean, I do know that the fathers were very, very much respected in the family and that everyone was supposed to look up to them. But I don't know about this language, because even the way I was raised, when you're married, you are then a part of another family, and that's who you will live your eternities with. So I'm not sure about that. But as far as feeling that she would be rewarded by living this law, that I can 100% stand behind, because of the way, well, not now. I don't stand behind it now, but I can understand it 100% because of the way that it was taught. Because in the FLDS, it wasn't like they were just making stuff up on the spot. They were using scriptures from early church members like Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, John Taylor. They were using scriptures from them, or teachings, writings, to show the community how important it was, not only to live right now, but that the celestial law or polygamy was a necessity for the eternities after this life as well. That was really the only way to return to live with God, was by accepting and living this law of marriage.
Yeah.
So I can understand where she was coming from there.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to follow on your wonderful observations, you know, for those who aren't Mormon, one of Joseph Smith's teachings is there's 3 levels in heaven. There's a celestial kingdom, a terrestrial kingdom, and a telestial kingdom. And the only place you get to live with your family, and the only place you get to live with God, is if you make the highest degree of heaven, which is the celestial kingdom. And who did early Mormon church leaders teach got to live in the highest degree of heaven or the celestial kingdom? Tell us, Sam and Melissa.
Those who lived the celestial law of marriage, which was polygamy.
And I mean, so, it's still in there. D&C 132. It still is in the scripture that those people will. We had
so what I read Edith saying here in her dream is that she she's not saying I loved polygamy because I, loved my sister wives. She's not saying I love polygamy because I loved sharing my husband with 3 other women. She's not saying she loved the fact that he was gone all the time. She's not saying she had a great relationship with him, that he was a great man. She's not saying any of that. She's saying that, number one, she loves it because now she's going to get to live with her dad, right? Who's an apostle, and also get to live with God. And it elevates her status in heaven in the afterlife. And I'm always bothered by any theology that says your life may be crap now, but you're going to have a lot of blessings when you die if you do the things that we say. And that's her justification. It's about reward she gets in the afterlife, not what she's living now, but also she's differentiating her reward from all her other siblings. And it's a little bit twisted. She's basically saying, I've got 35 other siblings, but I get to go to the celestial kingdom with my dad, and they're not.
Well, and I mean,
she thinks that's a bonus. I don't think she's a bad woman, but who would want to feel good about getting promoted to be with your dad and God when all your siblings are going to be left out? And I don't think she was probably fully thinking it through, but isn't that the implications of what she's saying here?
Well, and it really leads back to the fact that back in early church history, which kind of gets glazed over now, we think, okay, polygamy is, the celestial law. So you can live polygamy, you could not live polygamy. But there was a time, and I can't remember which apostle it was, or which prophet, that talked about specifically that you had to live polygamy to get to the celestial kingdom. And there's even places in other fundamentalist groups that use the teachings of, I can't remember who off the top of my head, where you would have to marry at least 3 women as well.
I believe it's Brigham Young. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I believe.
Yeah. So, I mean, there were very strict requirements of, you could be, all of her siblings could be great Latter-day Saints. They could all live great lives. But if she's holding true to these very early prophets and what they're saying, she needs to be married and her husband needs to have 3 wives in order to actually obtain the highest degree of celestial glory. Exactly. So, I mean, that part of the church history, we often hear about polygamy, and you're like, okay, polygamy is a law that some people lived and some people didn't, but they don't realize or recognize or really talk about the implications of, if you weren't living polygamy, you really weren't as righteous or you weren't going to have these same eternal blessings. And like you said, sadly, that comes down to women. So many times you hear similar things like that, where they're in these polygamous relationships because they believe that it is absolutely crucial to their eternal salvation. Yep. It's not a consent of, this is just what I want to do. This is the life I want to live. It's almost always under the guise of, this is what I have to do in order to be saved, or in order to be with my family forever, or to be with my apostle father, or to see any of my other family again. So, yeah.
It's interesting. It's interesting, John, that you mentioned that people will be willing to live a quote unquote crappy life on this earth because they're promised all the blessings in the next life, right? And they're okay with that. And it's interesting you say that, because just recently I was talking with someone from the FLDS community after all the things that Warren Jeffs has done to the community and the things that all of these families had to go through. Someone that was right in the middle of it recently told me that at the time, it was one of the most difficult things they've ever done. And it was just heart-wrenching and horrible, or they felt that it was just the most difficult thing. But after it was all said and done, they felt that it was a blessing because they learned so much, and they've learned so much from it, if that makes sense. And so with that perspective of, well, I'm just doing what God wants me to do on this life. I'm enduring all of these challenges and tribulations, but in the next life is when I'll be rewarded by proving my faithfulness to his teachings in church.
Yeah. And when you learn about high demand religions or cults, you realize that dealing out the afterlife and telling people what God wants and who gets what reward and who's going to be where in the afterlife. It's a form of undue influence. It's a form of coercion that is used to control and manipulate people. And, we certainly know that all these churches can't be true. So most or all of them are making up who gets to go where in the afterlife. And so once you realize that people are having these leaders that they think speak for and to God, telling them how to live their lives based on these false, empty, fake promises, it's a form of undue influence without informed consent that leads people to live lives they wouldn't otherwise want to live. And so that's why this is disturbing. And if you think about her 35 siblings that don't get to live the principle, it's not their fault. Like it's just because the boys weren't told by the prophets that they could, or the girls didn't get chosen into the right marriages to be able to practice polygamy. So then what kind of God is making it so some of his chosen children get to return and live with him, whereas others of his children, for no fault of their own, aren't being allowed into the celestial kingdom? It's just a weird economy of favoritism and injustice. Polygamy is an economy. It's a social economy of favoritism, elitism, and injustice. And to me, this is just one little paragraph, but it's disturbing on so many different levels,
Yeah. I wanted to ask you at this point, do you know what the way that polygamous spouses were chosen? Because for a while, in Sam's group in the FLDS, it's all arranged by prophets. Do you know at this point, like when Edith became the third wife, was it a deal between fathers? Were fathers making the arrangements? Was the prophet involved? I realized you don't really hear a lot about that now that, and I didn't think about it till you were just barely saying that when you were talking about how her father wanted to make sure that there was, a certain status. And for that split second when you were saying, well, he's kind of like the Warren Jeffs in this. And I was like, okay, but who was it? Did the prophet have any say? Were the fathers having to go to the prophets and arrange that? Could anybody say, like in DNC 132, could they just want their next virgin and go and ask the prophet and just get them?
So I actually have insight on this.
Oh,
believe it.
I want to hear.
I want to hear too.
Because the FLDS, they also come from they have ancestors that lived in Joseph Smith's day, Brigham Young's day, but the difference is they're very proud to talk about their polygamy heritage because they still practice and believe it. So they're very proud about it. So they would oftentimes share stories around the campfire, so to speak, about their polygamous heritage and all of that. And a lot of times in those days, back in the day, early church days, the men would see a girl that they had feelings towards or something, and they would actually go to the prophet or go to one of the leaders of the church and ask if they could marry her, or that they felt that even if they already had one wife, they would even in some cases start dating another girl, and then after dating for a while, then go ask the prophet if it was okay that they get married.
So courtship was actually normal.
Courtship was okay even in polygamy.
Huh.
Yes. And interestingly, my grandfather, not great, just grandfather, he actually was married within the mainstream LDS church before he decided to go with the FLDS. And then he was actually one of the main people to kind of get the FLDS up and running. Like he had a lot of influence in the early days of the FLDS church. And so he was already married to just one girl. He was married, and then he decided to go the FLDS route. And she went to her parents. His first wife went to her parents and told them that he was considering continuing on a life of polygamy. And they, of course, disapproved of it because this was long after the manifesto. And she ended up actually getting a divorce from him. And so she said, nope, not doing this. I'm out of here. And so they got a divorce, and then he went on to marry several women within the FLDS and polygamous group. So interesting.
So normal courtship, most likely.
Right.
Yeah. And just to just respond directly to the question, Melissa, I don't know who gave William permission to practice polygamy, because I guess it was secret enough to where there's no record I'm aware of where he wrote about that. But I would love to know. If anybody out there listening knows, I'd love to hear it. If any of my family knows, I would love to find that out.
Yeah, and I feel like it's something that within the LDS Church, even when polygamy is talked about, I don't think even in seminary, I remember they did start talking about polygamy. I feel like they're talking more and more to seminary students, more and more about that stuff now. But I remember them talking about it, but I never remember them ever bringing up what that process looked like and how the women were treated, really, or how they were. So anyway.
Yeah, and I well, here's what I know. If you start with Joseph Smith, who was the first polygamist, and this is something that people who study Mormon polygamy will know, is that Joseph was not only lying to the general public about his practice of polygamy, he was lying to the general church membership about his practice of polygamy, and he was lying to his own wife, Emma, about his own practice of polygamy, because Emma was like the 22nd or 23rd wife sealed to Joseph after he had secretly married 21 or 22 other women after he had married Emma. And so Joseph was only letting his inner circle of trusted men live the principle. And so you can only imagine that, because that's how Joseph did it, that once Brigham Young took over, he would have continued that practice of only allowing those in his trusted inner circle to be the ones to live the principle. And Brigham Young, my great-great-grandfather, Ezra T. Benson, would have known Brigham Young. So, so it's not like that's too far removed from what we're seeing here in this presentation, right?
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's just jump to what we know. You guys are all, I hope people aren't super bored, but
I think this is fascinating. I guarantee our viewers are going to be loving it too.
Okay.
Yeah, very interesting.
All right, so I thought it would be fun. I Googled William Brigham Parkinson. So that's my great-grandpa. That's Karma's dad. And I thought it would be fun to Google William Brigham Parkinson and see what I came up with. And it turns out that the LDS Church has what they call a church history biographical database. And they've got these little profiles of early pioneers that they're kind of proud of. And I was happy to see that my great-grandpa, William Brigham Parkinson, made the list. So it's got there his birth date, 1852. So he would have been born, after Joseph Smith died. His parents actually converted to Mormonism, but he was born in 1852. And as I scroll down to see more about what the modern, churchofjesuschrist.org website says about my great-grandfather, one of the things that I noticed that was a little bit suspicious is that it mentions one wife. It mentions that he was married to Margaret Wallace Sloan. And I have 3 question marks there.
Because your grandma's not on there.
Yeah. So number 1, why it turns out that Margaret Wallace Sloan was his 4th wife. So question number 1 is, where are the other 3 wives? Why is there only 1 wife? Question number 2 is, why is it the 4th wife and not the 1st? Right?
Yeah.
And then the other question that was really, really odd was that they have as the year 1892. Now, I'm sure you guys know why that was a red question mark for me. You guys want to tell us why that's odd?
Yeah, because the manifesto from Wilford Woodruff was signed in 1890. And for those of you who aren't very familiar with Mormon history, Wilford Woodruff, in 1890, when he signed the manifesto said that they were going to, the manifesto, there you go, was to state that the LDS Church was going to end polygamy and no longer practice polygamy. And that the manifesto is very interesting because he said that basically to get the government off of his back. But at that point, it wasn't like they were going to start separating polygamous families. So polygamy continued on afterward for a while. because while declaring, hey, we're not going to do this anymore, they also weren't going to just tear apart families. So a lot of families continued to practice polygamy, but they were supposed to stop. So to have proof stating that they continued on after the manifesto is a little bit sketchy.
Well, just to be clear, not only did they not break up the polygamous families after 1890, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints continued allowing polygamous marriages somewhere up to 15 years after they told the whole world, they promised the whole world and the United States government that they were stopping. And so this is called post-manifesto polygamy. It's something that mainstream members of the Church of Jesus Christ are not taught. When you hear a spokesman for the church, even in 2022, talk about polygamy, they're always like, we stopped that in 1890. But the truth is, all they did was tell the world that they stopped that in 1890, and then they lied, and for another 15 years kept practicing it. But it's one thing that I was never taught that growing up as a Mormon, when this was my own ancestry. It's another thing that the church hid it from us, but it's another thing to find out that this was my own family, that likely my own great-grandpa married a woman 2 years after the Mormon prophet promised the world that the church was going to stop practicing polygamy. So for me to discover post-manifesto polygamy in my own line of ancestry, that my parents, my great-grandparents' marriage was a lie and was illegal, was interesting, right? I mean, it made me feel a little bit proud that they were kind of defiant and edgy, but it's also deceptive and dishonest, right?
Well, and it's so interesting to me too that the church website would pick the one marriage out of all of them that goes against manifesto, because if they're going to try to portray a certain image, right, of and kind of ignore or try to, not really tell us a whole lot about those 15 years and really portray this idea that it stopped in 1890, but yet on their website, the only marriage they're showing is the one that went against that. That's very interesting optics.
Yeah.
And you would think that they would put the first wife on there, generally speaking. That's what I would have assumed.
Well, because normally it's only the first wife that is legally married anyway in a polygamous.
That is part of this story, because there's conflicting evidence about two things. That date, 1892, in the obituary, it's left off. In William's obituary, the year of his marriage to Margaret's left off of the obituary conveniently. But there are some family histories that date the marriage to 1890. And what I wonder is if they lied about the actual date. They either left off or lied about the actual year of the marriage in many of the histories. But what I also wonder, there's one part of the history that said that the fourth wife was the only one that he actually legally married.
That would be a very interesting case. Because that is not the common.
That the first three marriages, were legal. Now, there's other account that he actually divorced the first wife. And so there's conflicting accounts there. But I certainly read that the fourth was the only one he legally married. And that might explain why she shows up as the only wife in the history.
Well, and I was going to ask you because
that would explain it.
Yeah, on familytree.org, and I saw in later slides that you had that information. Do you have like the sealing information, like between Edith and William? Does it show their sealings?
There was we get to this, but there was no record of Edith's marriage to William, even in the rolls of the Logan Temple. And so what I read is that the first three marriages happened either in temples or in endowment houses. And in the case of my great-grandma, they didn't write down that the marriage ever happened. There was no actual record of it because it was post-manifesto, right?
Interesting.
Well, but the first three marriages should have been done pre-manifesto, right?
Yeah, but
those should have been normally the temple records.
They were still running from the law prior to 1890, right?
Yeah, I mean, but the church normally has pretty good records of sealing. So it's just really, I mean, that just adds another layer of a lot of mystery because
It does. Yeah.
even when they were running away, I mean, we still have records of who Joseph Smith sealed himself to, right?
Right.
And like who was sealed to Joseph Smith. And so it seems odd that somebody who wasn't a prophet or an apostle, like maybe I could see them trying to hide that. But other members of the church trying to hide those records when they do take so much pride in the fact that those sealings happened, so much that we do sealings for the dead.
Yeah.
That record of that is so important to the
Right.
church that they record it and you do it for the
Exactly.
dead. And so to not have like record of those sealings
Yeah.
is so interesting.
Well,
Yeah, that's-
yeah. Yeah, it's just mixed records. But what I get the impression of is that there was a lot of hiding, there was a lot of secrecy, there was a lot of lying, and illegal behavior. And guess what? That's how we judge the FLDS people, and
Correct.
that's my great grandparents, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hiding and
Yeah.
lying and secrecy and deception.
Well, I mean, that was very common with early church leaders. You know, I mean, the having to go into hiding,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that these are things that we were told about growing up in the FLDS all the time to kind of show us or teach us that going into hiding or running from the law was perfectly normal because they would say that it is God's law versus man's law. So,
Yeah.
which is most important?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if
So-
Joseph Smith did it, right? Joseph Smith hid from the law. He ran from the law.
Mhm.
And so if Joseph Smith did it, then there's no reason why everyone else shouldn't do it for righteous purposes.
Yeah, and in the ex-Mormon community, we refer to that as lying for the Lord. It's this idea that God's laws are higher than man's laws, and if the government tries to mess with our religious beliefs, we can lie. It's okay to lie, and that top church leaders for 200 years have been willing to lie and hide and misrepresent if it's in their best interest to do so and break the law. And
Mhm.
the modern Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints likes to point at the FLDS and say they're criminals, they're liars, they break the law, they're unsavory characters. But our church has just as much of a history of breaking the law and lying as does the FLDS church.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we have no moral high ground on you guys, is what I'm saying.
No.
Right? Okay. So a little bit about William Brigham Parkinson. This is just for background, kind of a character profile. He was born in 1852 in England. He and his parents joined the church when he was a boy. They come to Missouri. His mother dies while he's in Missouri. He and his dad travel to Oregon as pioneers. The dad remarries at some point, and then the dad dies. So William is left without his biological parents by the age of 10. Okay.
Wow.
His stepmother, it is reported, was stern or harsh with him. And so he runs away from his stepmother when he was 12 years old.
Wow.
And so he comes to Utah. He was a farmhand. He learned. So when my grandma Karma says he was a self-made man, he runs away from his parents when he's 10. He becomes a farmhand. He becomes a telegraph operator. He becomes a train dispatcher. And he does all that in his teen years without parents. So I thought that's pretty cool, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it gets better. He ends up, he marries 4 women in total. He has 25 children with those 4 women. And somehow in his early 20s, he starts gaining status. So he becomes bishop of the North Morgan Ward. So I think that's Morgan, Utah, which I think is a town north of Logan, but south of Franklin and Preston. But this was the part where another part that was really disturbing to me, that for me was really cult-like. So he marries 2 women by the time he's 26. He has several children by that point. And so, of course, what does the Mormon church do after he's married 2 women and fathered something like 3 to 5 children? What does the Mormon church do? when they've done that to him and to his wives, they send him on an effing mission to England, and he leaves behind those 2 wives while he's off bringing converts to the Mormon church. And he doesn't just leave the 2 wives behind, he leaves his own children behind. And so those, you asked Melissa or Sam, you asked whether they lived together or apart. During those first several years of that family, he was off serving as a missionary for the church while his 2 first wives lived together in poverty, right? And they relied on the wives' dads to support them while he was off serving for the church. And I just have to say, I want to guess that women needed emotional support and psychological support from their husbands, even in the 1800s. And the children needed their dads, even in the 1800s. And so the fact that the Mormon church would saddle these women and children in polygamous marriages and then send the dad away for multiple years, to me, is very troubling and disgusting, even in the 1880s and 1870s and 1880s. To me, it's disturbing.
Well,
I don't think that's presentism to call that disturbing.
No, definitely disturbing. And I mean, at that point too, you hear of that happening when certain prophets wanted the wives for themselves, but to leave them and not have it be for the personal gain of another person at all. I mean, both of those are disgusting on its own, but to have this be like to just leave them and abandon them.
So I have to ask you, for both of you growing up LDS, did you hear much about men being sent on missions after being married and after having children?
A little bit. And we were just taught, but not in a polygamous context. So we were definitely taught that, like, wow, way back in the day, men were sent on missions after they had been married.
Okay.
Which in and of itself is troubling. What we weren't ever told is these men were sent on missions with multiple wives and multiple children, leaving behind multiple families. That we were not told.
Yeah, I was not told that either. Yeah, I mean, I had heard, and I would say it was very like few and far between that we would hear some stories and be like, okay, wow, look how faithful and valiant. We never really ever focused on how that affected the woman's life or the children's life, really. And then it wasn't until later during our faith transition that I ever learned that, Orson Hyde got sent on a mission and Joseph was sealed to his wife while he was gone. And so that was the first time that I thought, oh, okay, there is this these bad intentions behind that, rather than where I grew up just thinking that, oh, they were sending these men on missions because it was the only way to spread the gospel, and how valiant and willing to just, trust in the Lord and those type of things. It was the first time where I was like, okay, there might be a darker side to why men were being sent. Right. And so that's why seeing this with your grandfather is like even more interesting because, okay, they don't have that malicious intent behind. They're just literally abandoning these women and leaving them with the father. You got to just wonder what was going through their minds. Like, why? Just why? Like, it doesn't make any sense. But what were you taught about it? Like,
no, the reason I ask is because I was actually, we had heard a lot of stories. People had lots of diaries and things. I wish I could get my hands on them now that would talk about these experiences that they had in polygamous marriages and their husbands going off to serve a mission and then coming back, and the letters that they would write back and forth. And then sometimes their husbands would come back, take on another wife, and then leave back on another mission or something like that. So lots of interesting stories going on there. And actually we had, I wish I could get my hands on them. I'll try to ask any of my siblings and see if they have any access to them. But they actually had recordings, someone reading the diaries of some of these women back in those days, and it was recorded on a cassette tape. So I actually listened to several of these stories that way, and it's very interesting. And it seemed, the women would talk about how difficult it was to not see their husband for such a long time, and then they would talk about the exciting reunion that they would have when they would see them coming back up, and they would explain, in vivid detail, seeing their husband walking up, and when he left, he was clean shaven, and now he has a full beard, and how much they loved the beard, and just it is like very, very detailed information about how their experience was. So I am very intrigued or very curious if I can get my hands on any of that type of information so that we can share it here. But anyway, it was talked about a lot, actually,
And then
in the FLDS.
one of those things that was considered just like a happy thing, right?
Yeah, definitely. It was these men get the opportunity to go out and serve the Lord. What better thing to do? That was kind of the way it was looked at.
And I feel like it was hidden from most LDS members because they knew that most LDS members would not look at that. They wouldn't buy that it was some happy thing. I think the average Mormon is going to go, that's not cool. We don't do that. Like, what are you talking about? Taking our husbands away? Like, I mean, sure, be in elders quorum meetings all day on Sunday. We can deal with that, but don't like go on a mission. So I think that was something that they knew most people wouldn't buy that.
Yeah. Throughout this whole experience of reading about my ancestors, I wanted to avoid this idea of presentism, of basically whatever our values or perspectives are now, projecting those into the past as if, they should be living with the same values and morals and standards that we do now. So on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, that's really courageous, and that's really valiant and righteous that they made those sacrifices. But the truth is, as you guys were saying, if the Mormon Church today was making people practice polygamy, telling them that they wouldn't live with God or their families unless they did, making the women raise the multiple children in poverty while they sent men on missions, that would be revolting. That would be abusive. These, child and protective services would be called, and these kids might be put into foster care. So like, why is it glorious and cool that they did that 100, 120 years ago when today would be viewed as literally abusive and as neglectful? And I think it was abusive and neglectful back then. But here's the thing. We've learned through sociologists that, you would think logically that the less you require of your members as a religion, the more devout they'd be, because it'd be easier to be a member of that religion. But sociologists have told us that the opposite is true. The more you demand of your members, the more loyal and devout they are. And that's where the culty bite model comes in. The more you control behavior, whether it's sexual behavior, dress, the music they listen to, the things they read, the more money you ask them to pay, the more devout they are. And so, Sam, when I find out that your parents in 2022, with all the information that's out there about Warren Jeffs and him being imprisoned and being a pedophile, and like all the different ways that the church is now being exposed, to learn, Sam, that your parents are still believers in 2022. Why is that? It's because they have sacrificed so much already that that sacrifice has bonded them to the church in a way that makes it almost unmovable. Right. And that is the sign of an abusive organization or a cult, one that requires so much of their members that no matter what, they're never going to abandon their allegiance to it. And this sort of polygamy, this sort of abuse that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints expected of some of its members, was beneficial and advantageous to the Mormon Church because it sealed multiple generations of wealthy, affluent members to the church in a way that a normal religious institution would not seal loyalty. Yeah. And so they sold it to us as faithfulness and righteousness and of goodness. But if we look at it in what I think is an accurate lens, it's actually undue influence, undue expectations, abusive levels of expectation that binds loyalty and commitment, but at a heavy, heavy, heavy cost to what I believe is mostly the women. It's mostly the women that paid the price of the $1 trillion organization that is the modern Mormon church was built on the backs of the sacrifices of polygamous women.
Yeah, I can totally see that. And when you're talking about the being able to separate, not trying to put our lens of modern day onto them, it reminds me of a lot of like growing up in St. George. We had Brigham Young's winter home there. And so we would go and tour that and, take pictures there because it's beautiful, has a little orchard. And I remember from a young age, them talking about the fact that how hard it was on these women because they would stay there all year round. And back then, farming was tough. Like the men would be doing the farming and things, and the women were even just being able to like get water and take care of children and just feed their families was a woman's full-time job. So to take the men away, and they were saying how hard it was on all of Brigham Young's wives because they never had him around. He had so many wives, and just what this crazy trial it was. And I remember from a young age thinking that is just so messed up because like what did they get? Eternal salvation someday. Like you said, the crappy life now so they can have the afterlife later. And that was basically all they had to cling on to all the time because they didn't have a loving, supporting husband around. They didn't have somebody to even just help with the day-to-day living. And I would say, life in the late 1800s was a heck of a lot harder for a woman. They have a dishwasher no electricity,
no indoor plumbing, right? Like all the chores you're doing manually without any appliances. You're having to cook all your food on gather wood, chop the wood, burn the wood. There's no plumbing, so you're having to go collect the water and bring it in. Imagine that, and with 9 kids each, and without a dad,
no husband. That would have been that's hard enough. That's hard enough with a spouse. That's hard enough as a team, let alone to have it all by yourself. And so I just completely agree with you that
yeah.
Oh, and that's why you hear. Oh, go ahead.
No, please.
Oh, I was just going to say that's why you hear of young children back in those days and in my childhood because it's the same thing. That's why you hear of very young children starting to do adult type jobs and labor and that type of thing because like you say, they have 9 children. When the older children get to even close to being able to do these types of things, they were out there working on the farm or out there doing whatever had to be done to help around the house. So that definitely put the children to work at a young age to accomplish all of that.
Yeah, and there's got to be benefits to that. Like in my summary, I say that it was great for the men. Polygamy was great for the men. It seems like it was good for the children, but horrible for the women. Because there's probably, when I hear about your upbringing, Sam, and all the ways you learned to work hard and to be honest and to be industrious, like there's a lot that I envy about that. And I wish my own kids, I could have given my kids a lot of that. So I don't want to say it's all bad, but I think it's an unqualified bad for the women. That's what I think. I think it's abusive to the women.
Oh.
But the interesting, they wouldn't admit that though, because they were raised that way and they believe that it is what they're supposed to do. That's what this life is all about.
That's why I showed that quote from Edith, where when she says polygamy was good, she doesn't say it's because I had an awesome life. Mm-hmm. She says that even though my life was difficult, I'm going to be in the celestial kingdom with my apostle dad.
Yep.
And if that's great, if it's true.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
But if it's a lie or if it's a made up phony doctrine that, by the way, we no longer practice in the church anyway, so why did she go through that sacrifice if in 2022 it's no longer required? So either way, it wasn't necessary. If that doctrine's not true, then she lived a grueling, abusive life of neglect for no reason. And that's what we're about to see.
Yeah. That was, yep. Amen to that. Or I guess I do have one more thing and then I'll let us move on past this. Sorry.
Yeah, please.
Just with the women, the idea of this, like enduring to the end is such a big thing, and a couple different times I've thought this, so I'm like, I just got to get it out. But I think it's interesting that for people who aren't members of the church, when they hear the word endure,
Yeah.
It is almost always something bad, right? And I was just thinking of it as we were talking about enduring to the end, right? And just enduring to the end. That's such a common phrase in Mormonism. And you grow up with it being a positive thing. Enduring to the end is positive. But for somebody, and a lot of our viewers have never been LDS or not as familiar, if anybody else hears the word endure, what does that mean? To endure something?
You have to put up with something.
You have to put up with something, or it's something that's hard or awful or tough or just like not positive. Enduring is almost never a positive experience.
Yeah.
And that comes back to the crappy life, right? Enduring to the end, we've put this lens on it as it's all positive, because once we endure, then we get the reward. But really, the enduring part, why should we have to endure life when it could be enjoyed?
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll let you give it.
No, Melissa, this is great. And the theme that I really walk away with, and I'll get to this at the end, but I want people to start paying attention to it now. We talk a lot about, in 2022, we talk about how Native Americans, the genocide and the displacement of the Native Americans in the United States, which we should talk about. We talk a lot about the African slave trade and bringing over African slaves and how they were enslaved and abused and beaten and killed. We should talk about that. We talk about the Holocaust and the way the Jews were treated, in World War II and before. We should talk about that. What we don't talk enough about is about the mistreatment of women and the way women have been abused for multiple generations, and frankly, for the history of civilization. And to show how low women's status is, we'll talk about the LGBT, epidemic of LGBT suicides. We'll talk about blacks and slavery. We'll talk black people in slavery. We'll talk about Native Americans, but we forget about women. And the truth is the great tragedy of polygamy is the neglect and the abuse of women. And to me, that's the great takeaway. And I want people to pay attention to how these 4 wives were treated. Yeah. Because to me, that's the story here, is the way the women were neglected and treated. Okay?
Okay.
Is that all right?
All right.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
So William Brigham Parkinson, if you read his obituary, he's this amazing man. He was a missionary. He was a bishop. He was prosperous. He was a self-made man. He became a doctor. He studied at Rush Medical College in Chicago. He got his MD from Louisville Medical College in 1892. He was a successful physician in Logan. He's one of the first physicians in Logan, Utah. He specialized in ear, nose, and throat. He made several trips to Europe to practice, Vienna and France, to develop a specialty in the ear, nose, and throat. Berlin, Paris, and Vienna, he made trips to, all for medical training. And he died heroically in 1920, helping treat people in the influenza. So rich, educated, powerful, successful man. What were you going to say, Melissa?
Oh, I was just going to say, that's the epitome of self-made. Like, man, from age 12, being on your own and doing all that. I also find it's interesting that medical college in Chicago at 1892. So he would have had all 4 wives at this point, going to medical school with 4 polygamous wives.
So what about the women, right?
What about because I'm like, do you think he took 4 wives to Chicago? Sorry, I say it like my mom because she's from Chicago.
Exactly right. So let's get into that. Let's get into that. Right?
Let's get into that, John. I want more. More.
So really quickly, here's how it's sold to us as descendants. It's like, look, there's William Parkinson in front of Pioneer Drugstore in downtown Logan. This is like right next to the famous Bluebird restaurant, and there's dirt roads in Logan. This is 1912, and this is rich, affluent Dr. Parkinson and his horse-drawn carriage in front of his own drugstore. What an amazing, wealthy, powerful, righteous, spiritual guy, right? And then here's the photo I referred to later. This is William now in front of, proudly posing in front of his one of the first automobiles in all of Cache Valley. So that's kind of how it's all sold to us. It's just, we're not told. Remember, Karma didn't mention any of the other women except for her own mom. But what she did mention is how rich William was and how prosperous and educated he was. So now let's get into the wives, the stuff that my mom couldn't have even mentioned the names of her other grandmas, right? She didn't even know their names. So the first thing that we should all just kind of realize is the polygamous wives were basically nameless. They were basically unknown and nameless. They were ciphers. They were nobodies. They were the women who were nameless, who stayed home and raised the babies, right? It was William who got the obituary of him being a famous, prestigious, affluent doctor. The women were nameless nobodies, right? So let's talk about the nameless nobodies, which were William's wives. He had 4 wives. It was Elizabeth Bull, who had 7 kids, Clarissa Taggart, who had 7 kids, Edith Benson, Karma's mother, who had 8 kids, and then Margaret Shaw, who had 3 kids, 25 kids in total. That's the full story that my grandmother's history never even mentions, right? That my mom was never even really told about, other than just, grandfather William was a polygamist and had a happy, healthy life, with no mention of even the names of the women, let alone what their lives were like. Now, any quick questions before we dive into it, or should we just dive in?
Dive in. I'm ready.
Okay, so these are kind of the genealogies of the 4 women. And, what we know is that Elizabeth, the first wife, married, William is 21 when he married Elizabeth. She was 20. So he didn't rob the cradle, so to speak. He married her when he was 21 and she was 20 in, I don't know the exact year. It's, they got married in 1873. So William's first marriage was in 1873 when he was 21 years old. They were married in Salt Lake City, and it's unclear as to whether or not that was a legal marriage or a marriage just on the rolls of the temple or in the endowment house. It's a bit disputed. So there's a listing of the kids. Pay attention to the ages that the wives lived, because even though Elizabeth lived about as long as William did, the other wives didn't fare so well. And I think you should associate age of death with how good their life was. Is that fair to say? Like, developing countries judge their status as a developing country based on mortality rate. Right. So what's the mortality rate of the polygamous wives? And if we go on to the second wife, Clarissa, right? She's 17 when she marries William. He's 23 when he marries her. Guess what? She dies by 45. So, it may not be fair to blame that on the polygamy, because it may have been, it probably was disease that also affected her. But we are seeing a trend here. The second wife dies at 45, marries at 17, has, 7 kids, dies at 45. The next wife, Edith, which is my, great grandma, she gets married at 18, dies at 58. He marries her when he's 34. So he's 34-year-old marrying an 18-year-old. So the underage theme starts entering in. And then the fourth wife, she's a little bit older. She's 40 when she's 30 when she marries him. He's 40. So again, he's 10 years older. He clearly likes marrying wives that are a decade or more younger than him, if possible. So, and then she dies at 51. So the second, third, and fourth wives all die basically a decade younger than he lived to. So not a good mortality rate for the plural wives.
Interesting.
It's interesting. I've never seen anyone compare the mortality rate, so I find that very intriguing.
Yeah,
I'm
that's a
definitely going to
first for
start
me.
paying a lot more attention to that detail that I've never paid attention to before.
And it's anecdotal, like, because I don't have the average ages of death of polygamous women in Mormonism broadly. All I
Right.
can say is it clear, and I put these stats up here because I read about their lives. And when I read about how crappy their lives were, I'm like, wow, I wonder what ages they died at. And that's when I realized, whoa, they're all dying much younger than he lived too. And by the way, he died early because he was treating people in the influenza. If he had not died because of the flu, I think he would have lived a lot longer than all of us.
What was his age? I'm sorry, when he died?
At 68.
At 68.
As he was
there he is.
treating
Okay.
people for the flu during a global pandemic before modern medicine, right?
Yeah.
So, so heroically, he dies treating people for the flu, but that also made him end prematurely. I think he would have lived another 10 or 20 years because he was so wealthy and prestige, of high status, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of a high level view of these 4 marriages, their ages, their deaths, and the number of kids. Now let's go ahead and dig into the 4 marriages. So this is Elizabeth. We're going to name the wives now. We're going to do something that we haven't done in our histories. We're going to give them names, and we're going to actually learn whatever we can learn about them.